Hello, my name is Joseph Jolly. I am looking at the culture of Army leaders, a study of leadership and higher ranked officers. Here is my abstract. Higher ranked officers in the Army are an elite group of individuals that have dedicated a large portion of their lives to serving their country. Their culture needs to be continuously researched in order to improve the standard of adequate leaders in the military. The scholarly journals that pertain to higher ranked officers and leadership have described in detail how the Army creates leaders based off of military doctrine. So the gap in literature is the different dynamics of great leaders in the Army outside of written doctrine. To address my research of higher ranked officers without full consideration to military doctrine, I interviewed professionals that have experience being a leader in the military and individuals that have surrounded themselves with leaders in the military. These findings generated a great discussion for how a great Army leader should present themselves and how they should interact among their subordinates. So why this topic? The purpose for researching higher ranked officers? I'm a member of the Army National Guard and the Reserve Officer Training course at Truman State University, and I strive to be the best leader I can be. Here is a breakdown of my research. I will start with the introduction, introducing this genre of Army culture. Then I'll look at Army leadership, prior research to leaders in the Army. And then I'll go into my methodology, interviews with leaders and aspiring leaders, and then I'll conclude with my results, summarizing my findings. Let's start off with our introduction, introducing the genre of military culture. To appreciate the importance of this study of leaders in the military, it is necessary to recognize the purpose of the United States Army. The United States Army is a military folk culture that has to organize themselves for any current or future military operations that pertain to war. War is a hectic experience for soldiers because of the injuries and possible death that comes with warfare in a combat setting. Because of this, soldiers are taught a certain military rhetoric that dehumanizes their minds so they can rationalize warfare in the modern era. Soldiers are introduced to this rhetoric at basic combat training and normalize the concepts of killing opposing threats or even dying at war. Army leaders must find a healthy balance in guiding soldiers to uphold both moral principles and military ethics. It is important for the Army to create the best leaders for their soldiers so these ranked officers can establish the best environment for the ethical challenges that come with a combat setting. The culture of Army leaders needs to be continuously researched in order to improve the standards of adequate leaders in the military. Now let's take a look at Army leadership, prior research to leadership in the Army. The primary source for the official military doctrine for ranking officers is ADP 6-22, Army Leadership in the Profession, which presents a professional model for setting standards and outlines the utilization of mutual trust and confidence in completing missions. This text is split up into 10 different chapters that dissect the leadership, direct, organization, and strategic attributes of ranking officers. The introduction defines leadership as the activity of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. Leaders should directly establish a firm presence for his or her subordinates. ADP 6-22 outlines instructions for how this leadership should be practiced over time in order to overcome challenges and achieve adaptability. The text ends by teaching different strategies ranking officers need to transition leadership skills at an organizational level. This text lays out the foundations for leadership in the military, but there are negative impacts that transpire when the Army dedicates how ranking officers interact with their subordinates. Military doctrines such as ADP 6-22 have hindered how Army leaders operate amongst their subordinates. Army leaders have to deal with the authoritarian tendencies of higher command, bureaucratic requirements of the military organizations that enforces fixed routine outcomes, conformity that is compounded by the very structure of the military. There is a resistance to cooperation, a dogmatic view on doctrine, and an anti-intelligentism. With these fixed incomes and outcomes due to military doctrine, it is hard for a leader to gain mutual trust and respect from their soldiers if they are forced to follow doctrines word for word. Official military doctrine enforces soldiers to be ideal models, which prevents them from learning fundamental fellowship skills they need to properly lead. Army leaders center their leadership around the official military doctrine but do not follow the doctrine verbatim. Leaders in the Army refer to this as the commander's intent, which is a leadership concept that changes on an operational basis. The commander's intent is a great tool for Army leaders to make moral heightening changes. There needs to be more advances with this type of situational leadership in order to develop the best leaders the Army has to offer. The scholarly journals that pertain to higher-ranked officers and leadership have described in detail how the Army creates leaders based off of military doctrine. So the gap in literature is the different dynamic of great leaders in the Army outside of military doctrine. Now let's look at how I researched the gap in literature with my methodology. To address my research of Army leaders without full consideration of military doctrine, there needs to be an examination of professionals that have experienced being a leader in the Army and individuals that have surrounded themselves with leaders in the Army. This is the most suitable approach because leadership is an important aspect to a military organization, and it should be continually studied in order to achieve effective, qualitative, and competent leaders. This method used descriptive research through interviews of military leaders along with aspiring leaders in the Army in order to effectively gain a wide perspective of veteran and inspiring leaders. The interviews gathered information from a retired veteran, an active duty leader, a reservist leader, and 2 individuals that just started in the military but plan on making it a career. The 5 individuals that I interviewed were Justin Hernick, a retired full bird colonel in the Army, Russell DeBrow, a major in the reserves, Michael Walmsley, who was an active duty master sergeant, and 2 cadets consisting of Colby West and Benjamin Tracy. Each participant was sent an invitation via email. Each interview took place within the ROTC department in Barnett Hall at Truman State University throughout a 2-week period. The lengths of the interviews varied from 60 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on how much input each respondent wanted to confer pertaining to Army leadership. Each interview started with the background of the participant, so an understanding of their experiences would produce a better conversation along with additional questions. Then the respondents were asked what it takes to earn a subordinate's respect and if this lines up with stereotypes in the military. Each veteran that was interviewed thought critically of their experiences as higher-ranked officers, and the interviews ended with their advice for aspiring leaders. There was an alternate question for aspiring leaders that asked what young soldiers look for in a great leader. Let's dissect my results and summarize my findings. After gathering multiple perspectives pertaining to Army leadership and analyzing the collected data, the results went against my initial predictions. I predicted that ranked officers were judged on their experiences in the military because soldiers with experience are typically placed into leadership roles. The participants that I interviewed explained that ranked officers with experience should not always be placed into leadership roles because everyone cannot lead soldiers. They believe experience is almost meaningless to young soldiers if ranked officers had no proper leadership skills. The 3 veterans leaders broke down the proper leadership skills for ranking officers in the Army and thoroughly explained leadership culture. Throughout the interviews, these leaders explained leadership as it pertains to responsibility of the Army, how to earn respect from subordinates, and how future leaders should interact with their soldiers. Subsequently, following my breakdown of the veteran leaders' feedback, there is an explanation to how the 2 inspiring leaders react to leadership in the military. Each Army veteran explained their reasoning for joining the military, but ultimately they had the same responsibility to protect the United States and their soldiers. Ranking officers have a great concept of this responsibility because they embrace the Army's culture, which is intended to prepare soldiers for armed combat. The Master Sergeant described the purpose and the responsibility of the Army by stating, "I learned that the Army is an organization is placed here to protect the continental United States. It is a different culture and a way of life. I have had to live in this culture for over 20 years, so I know how this way of life prepares us for potential threats." Just like any other folk group, the military has a certain culture that has been passed down from generation to generation. These leaders explain that the culture is different because they have a diverse set of individuals meant to protect the United States. This is why the Army is a performance-based organization that must uphold a current standard. These standards give soldiers additional responsibilities to uphold their physical and mental health in order for optimal readiness to protect the United States. The Army leaders explained that if soldiers do not maintain their physical or mental health, the Army will correct or discharge that soldier. Physical impairments include the military considering soldiers overweight based on their height, not being able to pass a physical fitness test, or having an injury that prevents them from completing their job. The major remarked how physically unfit soldiers are viewed by subordinates. I enlisted into the infantry component of the Marines, and the higher ranked officers set a standard for being in great shape. Higher ranked officers in the Army need to be physically fit and look like a soldier. If they do not look like a soldier, then they lose credibility. It is crucial for Army leaders to set the standard for fitness so young soldiers are encouraged to maintain a proper level of fitness. In addition to physical fitness, soldiers need to be mentally stable enough to be an attribute to the Army. Mental impairments include post-traumatic stress, addiction to substance abuse, a traumatic brain injury, or maybe even depression. The retired colonel explained how mental impairments have affected soldiers that have went to combat areas. The Army is meant to protect the United States from possible threats or attacks, so we need to be mindful where we send our troops. Soldiers that have come back from overseas have mental issues that the Army had to spend billions of dollars trying to fix. The military challenges the mental well-being of soldiers, so soldiers need to be able to adequately check in on their soldiers, while simultaneously caring for their own mental needs. The Master Sergeant gave great insight on this concept when he stated, "One 5-minute conversation can prevent a soldier from taking their own lives." Along with serving the United States, Army leaders have a responsibility of making sure their soldiers are physically and mentally fit enough to protect their country through their various occupations within the military. When asked about respect, these three veteran leaders brought a conversation to stereotypes and material culture in the Army. This culture is something I did not consider when thinking of leadership in the Army. Material culture in the military presents soldiers that exhibit their experiences and accomplishments to one another. For example, a uniform is set up in a way where a soldier's rank is displayed, whether they have been on a deployment to a combat zone is displayed, and what schools they have attended in the military are on display. Uniform displays major accomplishments with the additions of different patches and badges. The leaders explain negative implications that derive from disrespecting or respecting a ranked officer based on how their uniform is displayed. In particular, the major spoke about the negative implications and stated, "Rank does not afford respect, just courtesies. Building trust with subordinate earns respect. Having a deployment patch is like having street cred in the military. People have patches but don't know shit. In peacetime, military patches are rare, but you don't have to be on a deployment to be credible. Deployment gives knowledge, not leadership." The other two leaders gave similar responses and gave personal explanations to why material culture is immature culture around the Army. There are plenty of misconceptions of how to earn respect in the military, such as material culture, but these Army's leaders gave great explanations of what respect looks like in the military. The three leaders had a consensus that the best way to earn respect from subordinate soldiers is to treat people like people. The Master Sergeant explained how the military, almost to a fault, dehumanizes soldiers in a way that makes the whole Army feel like a numbers game. The idea of a numbers game means that the Army recruits as many soldiers as they can without much consideration for them after they enlist or commission. With this stigma in the Army, soldiers want to feel respected before they can fully respect their leaders. Soldiers feel respected whenever they have a competent leader that understands fundamental leadership skills, even if they are new leaders without much experience. The retired colonel explained this leadership by stating, "Show leadership skills by taking care of soldiers. Recognize your mistakes and working harder than any other person in the platoon. Brand new second lieutenants without much experience can be competent of leading soldiers." He continued to explain how soldiers assume through interactions with their superiors whether they are a good leader. So Army leaders should be experts at their crafts or be able to listen to soldiers' input so they can educate themselves on matters they are not aware of. The Master Sergeant expanded off this point and explained that new leaders without experience or even age leaders should be humble, ask for criticism, and accept guidance in order to improve their leadership skills. The leadership style will set soldiers up for success in a way that will reflect positively in their work ethic. The leadership skills that these Army leaders own are gained through experience and the mentorship of past military leaders. Each of these leaders ended their interviews with key pieces of personal advice on how to be a great leader. The major gave his experience with leaders and even referred to his experiences in the Marine Corps by stating, "No one has ever gotten taller, making people feel small. People will gravitate towards leaders. Some leaders are jerks to make themselves feel better. When I was in the Marine Corps, they had a saying, old Corps was better, new Corps is soft. All the old Corps has is institutionalized respect, but it does not mean people will respect their decisions as leaders." End quote. When people serve in the military just to bring down their subordinates, they will not be an effective leader. A statement such as old Corps was better, new Corps is soft is a part of immature military culture that is meant to belittle new leaders and young service members. Experience in the military gives leaders institutionalized respect through the custom and courtesies, but it is up to the veterans to utilize their experience to effectively lead their subordinates. This method of effective leadership is seen through being a selfless leader that puts their soldiers' mental and physical health above their own, which is based on the decisions they make. In order for leaders to be selfless, they cannot immerse themselves in all the achievement medals and accomplishments. The Master Sergeant ended his interview speaking on the downfall of material culture in the military by stating, "I could care less about tabs because it's just all flashy. It's all about the person looking for the best interest of soldiers. I have badges but decide not to wear them." End quote. The Army will test the mental and physical health of soldiers, especially if they have the opportunity to attend any of the various schools in the military. These schools are meant to teach soldiers military tactics and educate on different Army programs, but being a leader means providing purpose, direction, and motivation for soldiers, as previously stated in ADP 6-22. If Army leaders are not able to meet these basic leadership skills, then their experiences cannot reach their full potential. Soldiers that continuously work on their leadership skills will be able to properly utilize their experiences to effectively lead their subordinates. The consideration of young soldiers is essential to providing them the leadership they need to adequately complete missions. This means an Army leader should keep a certain type of respect with their subordinates by establishing the role as a boss without having any type of discourtesy towards young soldiers based on their lack of experiences. Leaders should judge their soldiers based on their work ethic, not their lack of experience. The retired Fulbright colonel ended his interview by discussing the downfall of disrespecting young soldiers because they are unexperienced. That just tears down soldiers and sets soldiers up for failure before they even start. It is not the soldiers' fault they are inexperienced. Judge soldiers on how they are performing." End quote. Every soldier deserves a chance to prove their worth ethic without being ridiculed for their lack of experience. The Army is a performance-based profession that needs to have unity in order to complete their missions. This unity is formed when both Army leaders and young soldiers gain mutual respect for each other. But this unity cannot exist if either side has lost respect for one another. These three great leaders, gave much needed advice on how to lead within the Army based on personal experience and without taking much of official military doctrine into consideration. Looking at military doctrine gave a definition to leadership and set up the institutionalized respect for leaders, but Army leaders gain leadership skills and personal respect by continuously navigating their soldiers' best interest. The military needs to shift focus from their immature material culture to engaging leaders to continuously work on their leadership skills. When leaders continuously grow and focus on the best interests of their soldiers, they will form unity to complete any assigned mission or task. The two ROTC cadets gave a great explanation to what attributes encourage young soldiers to gravitate towards certain ranked officers. For the purpose of the dissecting of their responses, the cadets will be referred to as Cadet 1 and Cadet 2. The information gathered from these inspiring leaders essentially backed up the information gathered from these three military leaders. The cadets both want leaders that will shape them towards common goals, which include gaining proper leadership and military skills. Cadet 1 described how he follows certain leaders on a situational basis by stating, "It depends on the conversation. If I want to understand mission tactics, I will listen to an Army Ranger, and if I want to understand military leadership, I will listen to an aged leader. I see my goals and line them up with people with experiences." The soldiers that inspired to be leaders will shadow whoever will help them accomplish their goals. That is why it is important for Army leaders to understand how much knowledge they can contribute toward a certain subject. If an Army leader cannot adequately help their subordinate, they should recommend that young soldier to another leader that can effectively help them. This type of guidance will help gain mutual trust and with their Army leaders and their subordinates because it shows that the leader has a certain level of consideration. Cadet 2 had a similar answer to Cadet 1, but had a more fellowship approach to leadership as it pertains to leadership in the Army by stating, "The Army is a job and a brotherhood. A leader should be willing to listen and care for someone underneath them. They should also shape groups of people toward a common goal. In the Army, it is difficult for leaders to uplift, but leaders have to avoid publicly shitting on people and wasting their time." Young soldiers respect leaders that have their best interests, whether that is uplifting them whenever they have failed or encouraging them to complete a task that will contribute to getting them dismissed for the day. Respect and the value of time are two aspects leaders need to take into consideration whenever they lead soldiers. The general consensus from these two cadets is that soldiers want leaders that will use their skills to teach inspiring leaders while keeping a certain level of respect. This consensus lines up with what the three military leaders described in their interviews, which was surprising because the inspiring leaders brought mature responses to their discussions. I am also an aspiring leader in the ROTC program, but I was taught to believe in experience over leadership skills, which is immature after self-reflection on the matter. These interviews just showed that a leader's skill set, along with their character, advise young soldiers to gravitate towards them in order to respect them as individuals. These findings generated a great discussion for how a great leader in the Army should present themselves and how they should interact among their soldiers. There are many assumptions based around the Army's material culture and stigmas against new leaders with less experience, but the three Army leaders explained the actual qualifications to lead in the Army. In addition to this, to my surprise, inspiring leaders also understood that they should not focus too much on stereotypes in the military because these factors do not necessarily define a competent leader. With that being said, Army leaders need to understand that they are defending the United States, their respect is earned through interactions with their soldiers, and they should continuously work on their leadership skills. Army leaders are a genre of military folk culture that do not receive enough attention through field work. To bring more research towards Army leaders, additional interviews could contribute to finding out if the Army is creating leaders in the most effective way based on the credentials soldiers need in order to be promoted to higher positions. These findings can contribute to my fieldwork in order to establish a better understanding of Army leadership outside of military doctrine and stereotypes within military culture. If the Army wants to create the best leaders they can, then they must continuously tear down the negative stereotypes and shadow veteran leaders that give great hands-on insight of the military. And here's my bibliography, all the sources I used throughout this presentation. Thank you for listening.